This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and it's Saturday, and that means it's time for another edition of Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series where I talk about limited magic. In today's video, I wanted to talk about 5 effects that people overrate in limited. It's sort of a companion piece to a video I did several weeks ago called 5 effects that are always bad in limited. Those are effects that people tend to overrate too, but the difference between that list and this one is that these effects aren't necessarily bad, they're just not as good as people often think they are. So let's jump into the list. So the first thing I have is what sort of inspired me to do this video, and that is play additional land effects, like on the Azusa saga in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. People think of this sort of effect that lets you play an additional land as ramping them, but the problem with this kind of effect is that you have to actually have the land in your hand already, and this doesn't do anything to draw you more cards. It's very probable that you play this on turn 2 and you only have 2 lands in your hand, and when you get to chapter 2, you have no benefit to be gained from the chapter giving you the additional land drop. So we see this effect on a lot of cards, and it's good, especially when it is included with card draw, you know, like on Growth Spiral, things like that. But you still shouldn't really overrate it, because the ability to play additional lands in limited is hard to take advantage of in most situations. You just don't draw enough cards to really take advantage. Again, you know, this effect isn't bad if you play this saga on turn 2, and you actually can take advantage of the chapter putting an additional land into play, and it actually makes a difference in terms of ramping you. It's pretty sweet. And that will happen if you play it on turn 2 a decent chunk of the time. But, you know, if you play it any later than that, and again, like I said, even if you do play a card like this on turn 2, there's not a guarantee that you'll actually gain any advantage. Again, these effects aren't bad necessarily, it's just not as good as ramping you, and it doesn't do something as often as people think it will. Another effect people tend to overrate is counterspells. You know, again, these aren't bad in limited, in most limited formats. There are some formats where they are bad, but in most formats they're fine. It sort of depends on the counterspell. But what's bad about these is people often think of them as their removal. And, you know, they kind of are removal, but they are removal spells, if you want to look at them that way. They're removal spells where you have to have your mana up at the exact right time, and your opponent has to play the card at the exact right time for the removal to work. You know, other removal spells, your opponent can play the thing, and then you untap and you can kill it. That doesn't work with the counterspell. If you don't have your mana up at the right time, you can't counter the thing, and that can be problematic. Again, there are advantages with counterspells, especially with Into the Battlefield creatures and stuff like that these days, where countering the thing is just better, and counter magic, again, isn't bad. It's just, you shouldn't think of it as removal. If it is removal, it's highly situational. It is very playable in many situations, although the Neon Dynasty counterspells, Disruption Protocol, and you know, the other one that's a reprint that puts a counter on one of your guys, neither of those has been very good. So, you know, in this format, the 2 common and uncommon counterspells aren't so great. But in most formats, counterspells can be kind of okay. But the reason they tend to not be that impressive, again, is because it's a very situational removal spell. So sticking with blue, I also want to talk about blue removal spells that are generally worse than removal spells. And those are some blue removal spells like Tamio's Epiphany. That's actually a real removal spell. It completely gets rid of a creature effectively. But the kind that either change a creature into something else, or just give it less power, just take away power from it, those kinds of removal spells aren't very good. They're not bad necessarily. If you need removal, you can play them, but they don't fully remove a card in most cases, and so you're not really getting a full card worth of value out of them. Just reducing a creature's power still means it can block, it still means it has its activated abilities, it still means it has its static abilities. It can even still attack, actually, it just can't do it as effectively. So all of those are a big problem. And part of the reason is these sorts of spells also don't actually get a blocker out of the way. You know, if the card can still block, it really hurts the value of a removal spell, because one of the great benefits of removal spells is, using one on your turn and attacking your opponent after you kill their blocker. Can't really do that with these. You sort of weaken the creature, and then your opponent can still block with it, and that feels pretty bad. So don't overrate these sorts of blue removal spells. We have one of them in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, the aura that gives -3/-0. They're just generally not that great, and, they're worse than counterspells even, I would say, in terms of the impact that they can have on a game. They just never have a big impact on a game, whereas counterspells can sometimes. So another effect people tend to overrate, similarly, is an Edict effect. This is also something that's a removal spell of sorts, but it's so situational and you have so little control over them that pure Edict effects cards that are just an Edict effect don't tend to be very good. And they're called edicts because there have been lots of cards in the past printed with this effect where target opponent sacrifices a creature. Your opponent gets the option, and yeah, if you play this early and your opponent has one creature, it can feel pretty good, but as the game goes on, this kind of removal gets worse and worse as your opponent will have things that are pretty expendable to sacrifice, and using up a removal spell to take away your opponent's 1/1 token, not really what you want to be doing. So you're again sort of falling short of a full card worth of value. We sort of have a version of this. It's not in a technical sense an Edict effect, but Debt to the Kami in Neon Dynasty is one of these effects. Your opponent doesn't sacrifice the thing, but they get to choose what gets removed, and that card is pretty underpowered in general in the format. No matter which option you choose, your opponent usually has something they can just get rid of that doesn't bother them that much. They are better early, but they get worse as the game goes on. And so these certainly, they're not anywhere close to being like premium removal because they're so situational and your opponent gets to make the choice in the end. And the last of these effects that people overrate in Limited are tutors. And I mean pure tutors. A card like Shrine Steward, which goes onto the table and searches you up a card, is pretty nice in Limited. A card like Idyllic Tutor, where all it does is tutor something up, isn't so good. And this is, generally when I'm talking about things in these lists, I'm talking about normal Limited formats. In Cube, tutors get a lot better because you can do all kinds of crazy combos. If we're talking about your typical Limited format, though, tutors, especially those that cost 3 or more mana, just aren't that good. It's tempting to look at them and say, well, I can just play this and get the best card in my deck. The problem is, most tutors we get these days are either overcosted or specific enough, like Idyllic Tutor only lets you get enchantments, specific enough that they're just not that good. And part of what makes them bad and Limited isn't even just that they're restrictive in terms of what they can search for, like Idyllic Tutor. It's the fact that you pay mana and you just net one card. So what you're doing is getting card selection. You're not really drawing a card. And unless you have an incredible bomb or a couple of them, tutors generally aren't worth running. If you do have bombs, tutors do start to get interesting, and that's when they are somewhat playable. If you have the kind of card, formats tend to have cards that are unbeatable. If you draft one of those and you can pick up a tutor, not a bad idea. But most of the time, in like 90% of your decks, you shouldn't be running a card that is just a tutor. You spend mana, you don't add to the board, and all you get is card selection. So it's really not that powerful of an effect, even though we think of them as powerful, especially if you play EDH where tutors are powerful, or if you're used to playing Cube or Constructed where tutors are powerful. It's just not the same in Limited. So those are 5 effects that people overrate in Limited. Now we'll do a crack-a-pack for Neon Dynasty. We're still, in the midst of that format. And as usual, we'll look at a pack one, pick one situation. I'll talk about every card in the pack, how I feel about it in the format, and then tell you what I would pick. Okay, so here is our pack. Our first common is a Gainland. These are nice in the format. Fixing is a great thing to have. You can splash bombs, you can splash removal. Most decks in this format end up at least splashing a 3rd color, and going full on 3 colors or 4 or even 5 is doable. And it's thanks in large part to these Gainlands. It'd have to be a really bad pack to first pick one, but you can prioritize them fairly early if you're interested in being sort of if you have picks that sort of lead you in the direction of being sort of a grindy multicolor deck, but I wouldn't first pick it. We've got Era of Enlightenment here. It's a saga. They're all pretty good. This is one I don't feel great about first picking. It doesn't do anything immediately. You do get, as with all of them, pretty good value for your mana, and you never cut them from your deck, but I don't think you really want to first pick Era of Enlightenment, though I think I would take it over a Gainland. We got Disruption Protocol next. I was just bashing counterspells and Limited, and even mentioned that this one isn't great in the format, and that is true. You know, it's an interesting artifact payoff, but you know, costing double blue is a pretty real cost for one thing, and you know, it's cancel if you don't have an artifact, and it has all the problems counterspells tend to have, and you know, it's just not very good. I think you end up cutting it more than you end up playing it. Golden Tail Disciple, it's an enchantment creature. You end up playing it in lots of white decks, but I wouldn't take it. Era of Enlightenment is where we are for now. Kaito's Pursuit, this has been pretty disappointing. You know, Mind Rots with upside have been kind of okay lately. This one doesn't really seem to get there in this format overall. The Menace thing doesn't come up as much as you'd think, and like usual, a Mind Rot isn't that impressive. Dokuchi Shadow Walker's next. I know a lot of people love this card, and I don't dislike it. I mean, I've played it plenty of times, but it's not that good. You know, like the either way you play the card isn't that great. I mean, whether, you know, ninjutsuing it in and hitting your opponent for 5 is great, but you're usually taking a tempo hit to do it. You return something to your hand, and then you have to play it again. If you're getting value out of playing it again like a good ninja deck, then that's sweet. And if you cast it normally, it's certainly not very good either. It's perfectly playable, but it's not something you should take remotely early. It's the kind of card that's like your 21st, 22nd, 23rd, you know, playable type cards. So I'm still on Era of Enlightenment. Next, we've got Twisted Embrace, though, and this will take over as the card we would take out of this pack. You know, it would be good in any format. You know, I gave this a B in the set review, which is a very high grade for a common, just because you get to kill a thing and you buff a creature, which is nice. Even has the upside of you can put it on an artifact if you're worried your opponent can kill your creature in response and stuff like that. But it gets extra good in this format where you have things that care about modifications and you have things that care about enchantments. And so it's just extra good. You know, returning this with the Hot Tub Kami to your hand is just like one of the most insane things you can do in the format. And that's just 2 commons. So we're on Twisted Embrace here. It's premium removal and it has all kinds of format synergy. Next up, we've got Guardians of Oboro. This card's not great. If you're a really controlling deck, it can kind of fit into your deck. And there are occasionally interesting blue-green decks where you have the 2-mana 3/3 Defender and Guardians of Oboro and ways to put counters on things where you can kind of end up in a sweet deck. I don't know how good the deck is, but it's definitely a sweet one. It's definitely not something you want to take early. Scrapyard Steelbreaker. This thing's fine, especially in black-red where you're more interested in sacking artifacts, but it's not really the kind of payoff where you're like, okay, I'm first picking that. We're still on Twisted Embrace. Dragonfly Suit. This hasn't impressed me that much. Overall, I generally would rather just have a Brute Suit if I'm going to have a Crew 1 vehicle. You know, because I think the stats plus Vigilance are better than Flying in this case. Plus, it's colorless, and that helps. It's certainly not bad, but it's not a great vehicle. Tamio's Safekeeping. This one's interesting. I think I gave it an F in my set review. And that has proven to be wrong. You know, we've seen a lot of these kinds of effects that look really bad, and that usually are pretty bad, where, you know, paying 1 to save your thing is just too situational. But in this format, it just turns out to be a pretty good card to have one of, especially if you have some powerful creatures that are, you know, key to helping you win the game. And the, you know, gaining 2 life is some nice additional upside. And so I was wrong about that card. And, you know, back when I did my video on cards that I was wrong about, you know, I did 2 of them, one on cards that have overperformed, one that underperformed. This one didn't make it because I wasn't sold on it yet, but I'm pretty sold on it now, being like a C or C- at least. A card that you're reasonably happy to have one of in most of your green decks. It just turns out that Hexproof plus Indestructible plus 2 life for 1 mana is enough that you end up with a card that is actually useful. Dragon Spark Reactor is next. This is a powerful payoff if you're in like blue-red or black-red, you know, the artifact decks, basically. And, you know, it is kind of slow, but it does do a pretty good job of being removal and even helping you win the game. That said, we're still on Twisted Embrace. Reactor is way too build-aroundy, and Twisted Embrace is just good in every black deck. Next up, we have Tawashi Guidebot, or Tawashi Guidebot. It's been pretty reasonable. You know, drawing cards with it in the late game is a pretty good way to find your way to a victory. If your deck has lots of ways to make counters, you can just do it for free sometimes, which is insane. And it's a pretty nice card, but I honestly think I'd take Twisted Embrace over it still. I think, you know, the Guidebot being colorless is a factor, but I think Twisted Embrace is enough better that it's what I'm taking. However, our next card is Twin Shot Sniper, which is one of the best uncommons in the set. If you can cast this and kill a thing, it just feels so good. I mean, you just get so much value. And the fact that you can channel it to kill something in a pinch, like where you really need to kill the thing, maybe they're putting an aura on it or something like that. They're making it bigger one way or another. They're using a trick, and you just have to fire this off. You just do it, and you feel pretty happy about it. It's also interesting that there are ways you can get it back from your graveyard after channeling it and things like that. So I would take the Sniper over Twisted Embrace. And then we have one of these channel lands. It's unfortunately probably the one that's like the least impressive. They're all good, and you would happily play Sokenzen Crucible of Defiance. But making a couple of 1/1s isn't nearly as good as, you know, like the green one, which can remove a bunch of creatures. The black one, which gets you something back from your graveyard. The blue one, which bounces something. And the white one, which is also a removal spell. All of those, well, I don't know. Twin Shot Sniper is so good. I think maybe I'd take the Sniper over all of them. Maybe not. I think the green one and the white one, I might be willing to take over it. They're both, you know, flexible removal spells, basically, that happen to be lands, and they're all pretty good, but you definitely don't take Sokenzen over Twin Shot Sniper, and I don't even know if I'd take it over Twisted Embrace. It's definitely a very good card, and one you can take early, but our pack is strong enough that there's 2 cards in it that I'm pretty happy to first pick. And Sokenzen would be a card I feel okay about first picking, but I think, you know, the removal spell and the creature that comes into play and kills something are both better than Sokenzen and its flexibility. So yeah, I'd take Twin Shot Sniper in the end here, followed by Embrace, probably followed by the Sokenzen. Yeah, that's probably the order I would take things in out of this pack. Yeah, so that is our Crack-A-Pack for this week's edition of Nizzanotes, and that does it for this episode of Nizzanotes. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it. That makes it so other people enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, including Nizzanotes, set reviews, draft videos, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can do that on Patreon. Thanks for watching.